This is the first time in my life farming that I still have crop in my bins that I can't sell.
Farmers across the United States are, of course, panicking right now because Donald Trump's tariffs are destroying what was set to be a record year for crop yield.
We're going to lose 25 or 30% of the farmers in this country if they don't do something. It has to be done, and it's not just here. It's everywhere.
Farmers are making a cry for help before it's too late. Countless farmers gathered to speak to representatives of Arkansas leaders to share the urgency that something needs to be done about the current state of farming.
It's awful discouraging. You know, we do our very best to grow a good crop to feed the world, and then we can't hardly give it.
I got to farm with my dad every day. It's a way of life. It's a wonderful way of life. And it's at risk. And it shouldn't be.
We worry about drought. We worry about pricing. We worry about equipment. We worry about financing. This tariff is just another thing that we have to worry about.
America's farm exports were supposed to be secure. Instead, a quiet pushback is spreading across African markets, and U.S. agriculture is feeling it. Contracts are being questioned. Shipments are slowing. Buyers are rethinking long-standing relationships, and the impact isn't symbolic. It's economic, measured in billions. This isn't a trade war headline. It's a market reality unfolding in real time. And by the time it becomes obvious, the damage may already be locked in. For decades, U.S. agriculture treated African markets as steady ground. Not always the largest buyers, not always the fastest growing, but dependable. Wheat, poultry, rice, dairy, and processed foods flowed outward under a familiar assumption. Demand would continue. Contracts would renew, and access would remain open. That assumption is now under pressure. What's happening isn't a sudden ban or a dramatic announcement. It's more subtle and more disruptive. African buyers are reassessing imports, governments are reviewing food security strategies, and local producers are being prioritized in ways that quietly change the math for U.S. exporters. This matters because agriculture runs on predictability. Farmers don't plant for headlines, they plant for markets that are supposed to be there months later. When those markets hesitate, uncertainty ripples backward into planting decisions, pricing, storage, and financing, and that ripple has begun. The first sign wasn't political, it was logistical. Exporters noticed orders taking longer to confirm. Port throughputs slowed on certain routes. Some shipments were renegotiated mid-process, with buyers requesting delays, smaller volumes, or alternative terms. None of it looked like rejection until it started adding up. Behind the scenes, African markets were making adjustments driven by three converging pressures. The first was food security. After years of global shocks, pandemics, conflicts, shipping disruptions, many African countries reassessed dependence on imported staples. Relying heavily on distant suppliers suddenly looked risky, especially when price volatility spiked or deliveries were delayed. Import substitution stopped being an economic theory and became a policy goal. Local grain production, regional sourcing, and intra-African trade gained priority. Not to eliminate imports entirely, but to reduce vulnerability. That shift alone altered demand patterns U.S. exporters had relied on. The second pressure was cost. U.S. agricultural products remained competitive in quality, but not always in price once transportation, insurance, currency swings, and financing are factored in, as freight costs fluctuated and the dollar remained strong, alternatives became more attractive. Suppliers closer to the market or offering different financing terms started winning deals that once defaulted to American producers. This wasn't about sentiment, it was arithmetic. The third pressure was leverage. As global competition for African markets increased, buyers gained options. Multiple suppliers meant better negotiating positions. And with those options came leverage to set new terms, sometimes favoring domestic producers, sometimes favoring regional partners, sometimes simply diversifying away from dependence on any single source. For U.S. agriculture, the impact was cumulative. Exports don't collapse overnight, they erode, a few percentage points here, a delayed contract there, a missed season that doesn't come back the next year. By the time the data reflects the change, the behavior is already established. Farmers feel this first not in policy debates, but in price signals. When export channels narrow, domestic supply builds up, prices soften, storage costs rise, margins compress. For operations already running tight, that pressure matters, and agriculture doesn't have quick pivots. Land can't be repurposed easily. Crops can't be rerouted instantly to new buyers at scale. Relationships built over decades don't transfer with a phone call. That's why this shift carries weight. It's not just about Africa importing less, it's about Africa importing differently. Procurement strategies are evolving. Some governments are tying imports to local investment requirements. Others are favoring suppliers who support processing, storage, or infrastructure development. Some are channeling demand through regional trade frameworks rather than overseas contracts. Each adjustment reduces friction for some suppliers and raises it for others. The United States isn't being singled out, but it is being tested. Historically, American agriculture benefited from reputation, reliability, volume, consistency. Those advantages still exist, but they now compete with new criteria: proximity, flexibility, political neutrality, regional integration. As those criteria gain importance, U.S. exporters face stiffer competition not because they've failed, but because the market has evolved. The financial impact follows quietly. $1 billion doesn't vanish in one transaction. It disappears across hundreds of missed opportunities, adjusted volumes, and renegotiated deals. Insurance premiums rise when routes are less certain. Financing costs climb when contracts aren't locked in early. Planning becomes more conservative. Those costs don't make headlines, but they reduce resilience. Rural economies feel this indirectly. Equipment purchases get delayed. Credit tightens slightly. Expansion plans pause. None of it feels like crisis until multiple seasons stack up. That's the danger of gradual shocks. They don't trigger alarms. They change behavior. What's unfolding now is less about rejection and more about repositioning. African markets are asserting control over how, when, and from whom they buy food. That assertion reflects economic maturity, not hostility. But maturity changes power dynamics. For American agriculture, the challenge isn't winning back a single market. It's adapting to a world where access must be continually justified, not assumed. And that adaptation takes time that farmers don't always have. The story at this stage isn't about blame or confrontation. It's about a structural shift in how global food trade works and where leverage now sits. Because when buyers gain options, sellers must compete harder. And when competition intensifies, even reliable giants feel the strain. This is only the opening chapter. What comes next is how U.S. agriculture responds, who steps into the gap, and whether this pushback becomes a temporary adjustment or a permanent realignment with consequences far beyond a single export season. What began as hesitation soon became strategy. African markets didn't just reduce imports quietly, they started rewriting the rules around them. And this is where the shift stopped being reactive and became structural. For years, global agricultural trade followed a familiar pattern: exporting giants produced at scale, importing regions. Accepted terms largely set elsewhere. Supply flowed outward, value accumulated upstream, and dependency was treated as efficiency. That logic no longer holds. African policymakers and buyers began asking a different question: not who can supply, but who adds stability. Food isn't just a commodity, it's political, it's social. And after repeated global disruptions, governments recognized that outsourcing too much of it carried risks that balance sheets couldn't capture. Hunger, inflation, and price spikes don't respect contracts, so procurement evolved. Instead of relying primarily on overseas suppliers, more African markets began structuring demand to support domestic and regional production, first using imports as supplements rather than foundations. This didn't eliminate U.S. products, but it changed their role, from anchor suppliers to optional participants. At the same time, trade frameworks across the continent matured. Regional integration lowered internal barriers, making it easier to move food across borders within Africa. That meant a shortfall in one country could be met by surplus in another, reducing the need for long-distance imports. This rebalancing mattered, because once local and regional supply chains strengthen, imports face higher scrutiny. Buyers ask harder questions about pricing, delivery certainty, financing terms, and added value. The days of automatic renewals fade. American exporters felt this shift not as rejection but as friction. Deals took longer. Volumes were negotiated down. Payment timelines shifted. Requests for joint ventures, local processing, or storage. Investment increased. These weren't obstacles, they were conditions. Conditions that many competitors were willing to meet. Suppliers closer to the market offered flexibility. Others bundled trade with infrastructure support or technology transfer. Some tied food exports to broader investment packages that aligned with national development goals. U.S. agriculture, built for efficiency at scale, wasn't always structured for these hybrid arrangements. Its strength lay in production, not concession. That mismatch created vulnerability, and vulnerability compounds. As African buyers diversified suppliers, competition intensified, even when U.S. products met quality standards. Price sensitivity increased, margins narrowed, reliability alone was no longer enough. At the same time, currency dynamics played a role. A strong dollar made imports more expensive for buyers managing volatile local currencies. Alternatives priced differently or financed differently became attractive. Payment terms became as important as price. Again, this wasn't ideological, it was practical. What made the moment decisive was visibility. Once buyers realized they could adjust sourcing without immediate fallout, confidence grew, options expanded, and with options came negotiating power. This is how pushback turns into leverage. African markets began setting standards rather than inheriting them, import licenses tied to quotas. Health standards aligned with regional priorities, procurement policies favoring suppliers that invested locally. Each policy shift seemed modest in isolation. Together, they reshaped the playing field. For American farmers, the consequences emerged downstream. Export uncertainty feeds directly into planting decisions. When future demand looks unstable, producers reduce exposure. They hedge more cautiously. They prioritize crops with stronger domestic demand even if export margins once made others more profitable. That behavioral shift ripples outward. Processing plants adjust capacity. Transport volumes fluctuate. Financing becomes conservative. None of this triggers emergency headlines, but it erodes scale advantages over time, and agriculture depends on scale. Once scale slips, costs rise. Once costs rise, competitiveness weakens, and once competitiveness weakens, regaining lost ground becomes expensive. This is where the billion-dollar figure begins to make sense. It's not a single loss, it's the accumulation of reduced volumes, missed seasons, narrower margins, higher financing costs, and slower investment. It's the opportunity cost of markets that no longer default to American supply. Meanwhile, African producers benefited from the reconfiguration as imports became selective domestic investment. Gained momentum, processing capacity expanded, storage improved. Logistics networks strengthened. The goal wasn't isolation, it was resilience, and resilience attracts capital. Investors prefer systems that aren't hostage to distant shocks. As African food systems matured, capital followed not just into production, but into value-added activities that once occurred elsewhere. That value capture matters. It keeps income local, it stabilizes prices, and it reduces future dependence. Ironically, this made African markets more attractive, not less to global suppliers, but on different terms. Those willing to integrate, not just export, found opportunity. Those unwilling to adapt faced declining influence. The U.S. remains a major agricultural power. That hasn't changed, but power now operates in a more contested environment. Access must be earned repeatedly, not assumed indefinitely. The pushback revealed a deeper truth. Global trade is no longer organized around dominance, it's organized around redundancy. Buyers want backups, sellers want reliability, and leverage flows to those who can offer both. African markets recognized this early. By refusing to overcommit to any single supplier, they created space to maneuver. By strengthening internal capacity, they reduced vulnerability, and by diversifying partners, they reshaped negotiations quietly but decisively. For American agriculture, the lesson is uncomfortable but clear. Competitiveness today isn't just about output, it's about alignment with buyer priorities, with regional strategies, with long-term stability over short-term volume. Ignoring that shift risks more than lost contracts. It risks relevance as this realignment continues. The question isn't whether U.S. farm exports will disappear from Africa. They won't. The question is whether they remain central or become supplemental, and that distinction defines who sets terms in the next chapter of global food trade. The final stage of this story examines whether this pushback solidifies into permanence and what it means for farmers, policymakers, and markets navigating a world where influence is increasingly earned far from the field.